Alta Vance did not look away when the three appraisers came through her gate on the morning of the 8th of April, 1886. And she did not look away an hour later either, when the last of them wrote a single figure beside her best mare's name and laid a silver dollar on the corral rail so that everyone standing there would understand exactly what he thought of her. She had 90 days. She owed the Verity Coal and Coke Company $680 on a note her husband had signed 4 years before he died, and the whole of what she had in the world to answer it with was 14 head of horses, 3 wagons, a set of chain harness with the tugs spliced twice, and 320 acres of shortgrass on Sink Creek that the company did not want and could not have. The sheriff's sale was set for the 7th of July. And under the law of the territory, her property could not be sold for less than 2/3 of what these 3 men wrote down on their sheet, which meant that the number they were writing was not a number at all. It was a sentence. They had started at the wagon shed at 8:30. It was the kind of April morning that country gets about 6 times a year and never advertises. The wind laid down flat, the short grass just going from tan to that first hard green that shows in the low places first. Meadowlarks going off in the sage like somebody dropping coins. Alta had put on her blue dress because it was the only good one she owned, and because she had decided, somewhere in the small hours, that she was not going to meet these men in a work apron with her sleeves pushed up like a woman caught at something. She had brushed it. She had pinned her hair back in the one braid. Then she had gone out at first light and led every horse she owned out of the pasture and stood them along the north fence in a line, in order, the way her father used to line a string for a buyer, because if they were going to price her, she was going to make them look at what they were pricing. Elmer Rask kept the grocery in Pilcher and had been appointed because he owned real property and could write a legible hand. Lyle Pardee was the deputy sheriff and carried the writ folded in his hatband. Ort Beddoe ran the livery and the freight barn at Pilcher and had wanted her outfit for 2 years at a price of his own choosing. Those were her 3 disinterested freeholders. And leaning on the top rail behind them, not appointed to anything, not required to be there at all, was Merritt Shand, superintendent of the Verity Coal and Coke Company, in a black wool coat he had not taken off since the 1st of March, watching a woman's horses the way a man watches a clock in a room where he is not enjoying the conversation. If you have ever stood still while somebody who did not know what he was looking at put a price on you out loud, stay with me through this one. Subscribe if this is the kind of story you want more of, because the figure those men wrote on the 8th of April was wrong by an amount that no one in Ammon County could have guessed that morning, including Alta Vance. They went down the line. Beddoe did the talking, because Beddoe always did the talking, and Rask wrote, brown gelding, aged, off hind splint. $18. He's 9, Alta said. He's aged, Beddoe said, and moved on. The 4 heavy mares her husband had bought with the money that made the note in the first place, Bird and Pet and Ruby and Jip, went at $28 apiece, which was $8 under what any of them would have brought in Rollins on a bad day, and $30 under what they were worth to anybody who had ever hooked them. The 3 saddle horses went at $15, $15, and $12. Eb Nance's little buckskin that Eb had broken himself and that did not legally belong to Alta at all got put on the sheet anyway at $9. And Pardee said mildly that he supposed that one could come off, and Beddoe said they would sort that out later, and it stayed on. Alta said nothing. She stood at the head of the line with her hand on the halter rope of the last horse, and she let them come. They came to her at 10 minutes past 10 in the morning. The mare was 16 hands and a shade over. Heavy through the neck and the chest and the gaskin, built like something that had been made for a purpose rather than for a look, and she was a dark liver chestnut, so dark that at 40 feet in poor light people took her for brown or for black, with a mane and tail the color of dirty cream. In the spring sun that mane looked like something out of a story. The rest of her did not. She was rough yet in her winter hair, dull, her coat coming off her in patches along the ribs the way it does in April, and there were 2 saucers of white hair on her shoulders, one on each side, where the hair had come back in wrong after something had sat on her a long time. She stood with her head low and her weight off nothing in particular, patient in the way of an animal that has been stood and stood and stood. "That's the windsucker," Beddoes said. "Her name is Maud," Alta said. "That's the windsucker," Beddoes said again to Rask, who was writing. "Bought her out of my own backlot in October of '84 for $4, and I told her at the time. Wind-sucking mare. Crib biter. She'll set her teeth on your rail and swallow air and grunt at you all day, and there's no cure known to man. Won't hold flesh, colic on you the first cold night. And she has taught it to every horse on this place by now, most likely, which, if you want my honest opinion, is a thing that ought to be reflected in the whole of this appraisal. It has not spread to one animal on this place in 20 months, Alta said. They all do it. They don't." Beddoes turned around then and looked at her for the first time all morning, and he smiled, and that was the moment Alta Vance understood that this had never been about the horses at all. "Well," he said, "put her down at 5. Rask had already started to write the 5. And Merritt Shand, from the top rail, without raising his voice, without taking his hands out of his coat pockets, said, 'Put her at $1. Rask stopped. $1, Shand said. "The animal has a vice that voids any warranty of soundness in this territory and any other. I would not take her as a gift, and I am the man who has to sell her. Put her at $1, and let us not stand out here all morning pretending." Then he took his right hand out of his pocket, and there was a silver dollar in it, and he leaned forward off the rail and set it down on the top of the post, flat, with the eagle up, and he stepped back and put his hand in his pocket again. "There," he said. "There is the market. It is standing right there in front of you." Somebody laughed. There were 4 or 5 of Beddoes' men down by the wagons who had come out to hold horses and had nothing to do, and one of them laughed, and then the rest of them did, because that is how laughing works among men who are being paid by the day and are bored. Eb Nance came up off the water trough with his fists made, and Alta said his name. Once, not loud, and he stopped where he was. Rask wrote the 1. He was not a cruel man. He was a grocer with a bad back who wanted to be back behind his counter, and he wrote the figure the way a man writes down a number somebody else has said, and he made the little dot and the 2 zeros after it $1 and no cents, and he blew on the ink out of habit, and he did not look up. The whole outfit came to $263. 2/3 of $263 is $175.34. That was the least the sheriff of Ammon County could let her life go for on the courthouse steps on the 7th of July, and against a debt of $680, it left a hole a person could have driven a 6-horse hitch through, and the hole would follow her. Because a deficiency follows you. She would lose the horses and the wagons and the harness, and she would still owe the Verity Coal and Coke Company something over $500, and there is only one thing a woman with no horses and no wagons in that country in 1886 could do about a debt like that, and it was to leave. They packed up. Pardee gave her a copy of the appraisal, folded, and he was decent enough to be embarrassed about it. And he said, "Ma'am, if there's anything," and did not find the end of the sentence and touched his hat and went to his horse. Beddoes said, on his way past, pleasantly, "You want to sell that outfit private. Before it comes to the steps, I'll give you 2 1/4 for the lot and save you the humiliation." "No," Alta said, 2 1/4 today. No, Shand did not say anything to her at all. He got on a good gray horse that the company owned, and he rode out through her gate and did not look back, and the wind came up a little the way it does around 11, and the dust off the road went sideways and thinned out and was gone. Alta stood where she was until she could not hear them. Then she walked over to the corner post, and she looked at the silver dollar lying on it. It was an 1881, worn smooth on the high points, warm from a man's pocket. She picked it up and turned it over twice and closed her hand on it. Behind her, at the fence, the mare set her top teeth on the rail and arched her neck and pulled a long, slow draught of air down into herself, with a sound like a door being opened in another room. Eb said, "Alta, what do we do?" "We haul," Alta said. "We haul everything anybody will let us haul, for 90 days. But she did not put the dollar in the coffee tin with the other money. She put it in the pocket of the blue dress, and it stayed in that pocket, through everything that came after, until the night it did not. To understand what a dollar meant on that fence post, you have to understand where the note came from. And to understand the note, you have to understand Wesley Vance, who had been dead 3 years and 2 months, and who was still, in a way that Alta had stopped fighting, the third person in every conversation she had with herself. Wesley had been a freighter first and a rancher second, and he had never entirely got the order of it straight in his own mind. He had come into that country in 1877 behind a 6-mule string hauling merchandise from the railroad to the camps, and he had married Alta Renner out of Cheyenne in the spring of 1879, and Alta had been a freighter's daughter, which is a thing that mattered later in ways nobody bothered to notice at the time. Her father had run wagons out of Nebraska City when she was small. She could throw a diamond hitch before she could do long division. She had been driving 4 horses on a wagon since she was old enough to reach, and she had grown up in a world where a man's whole standing among other men came down to whether his stock came in sound at the end of a haul, and where the single worst thing that could be said about anybody was that he did not know what he had. Wesley knew what he had. That was his trouble. In the fall of 1882, the Verity Coal and Coke Company sank the No. 2 shaft 4 miles east of Pilcher and put up a camp around it, and for about 18 months there was more freight moving in Ammon County than there were wheels to move it, and Wesley Vance looked at that and did what a man does. He went to the company store because the bank at Rollins would not lend on livestock and the company would, and he signed a chattel mortgage for $900 at 1.5% the month, and he bought 4 heavy mares out of a Missouri shipment and a new lead wagon with a steel skein and a set of chain harness, and he came home in a state Alta had only seen on him twice before and told her they were going to be all right. They were going to be all right. That is not a figure of speech. The arithmetic was sound. The freight was there. The rate was 90 cents the hundredweight to the camp, and better than that over the Kelso grade, and the note would have been clear inside 3 years. In February of 1883, Wesley took a load of pump timbers up the Kelso in wet snow and came home wet and did not get warm again, and 11 days later he was dead of it, at 36, in the bed in the front room, and the doctor from Pilcher called it lung fever, and there was nothing about it that was dramatic or unusual or anybody's fault, which is the part that Alta had the hardest time with for a long while afterward. Men died of getting wet. That was all. That was the whole of it. She was 28. She had a note for $900, 4 heavy mares that had been in the country 5 months, a hired man who quit inside the week, and 100 people who assumed, in a friendly and entirely sincere way, that she would sell out by fall and go back to her people. She did not sell out. She hauled. For 3 years, Alta Vance hauled coal props and pump timbers and boiler coal and mine rail and lagging and powder and hay and the odd load of household plunder, and she did it herself, on the seat, in all weathers, with a hired man when she could pay one, and without when she could not. And every quarter she rode into the Verity Company office and paid what she had against the note, and Merritt Shan's clerk wrote it in the book, and every quarter the interest ate a piece of it before the principal ever got touched. In 3 years, she brought $900 down to $680. That was not failure. Anybody who has ever carried a note at 1.5 a month knows exactly what that was. It was 3 years of very hard, very careful work. spent almost entirely on somebody else's money. By the spring of 1886, she had 14 head. The 4 heavy mares, which she had bred nothing from because she could not afford to lose their work for a season. 3 saddle horses. 4 assorted geldings that pulled. Eb Nance's buckskin. And Maud. Eb Nance was 20 and had come to her at 17 with nothing but a saddle and an opinion, and had stayed. He talked too much and ate like a threshing crew, and had the best hands with a young horse of anybody in that county, and he had been offered $35 a month twice by outfits with money, and had said no twice, and when Alta asked him why, the second time, he went red to the ears and said that a man liked to work where the work was done right, which was as close as Eb Nance ever got in his life to saying anything sentimental to anybody. The trouble that put the appraisers in her yard did not come from the note. The note she could have carried. The trouble came on the 4th of March, 1886, and it came in one sentence, in the company office at Verity, from Merritt Shand. "We are not renewing your hauling," he said. She had been standing. He had not asked her to sit, which she noticed, and filed and did not mention. "Since 1883 I have hauled every stick of pump timber that went down that shaft," she said. "You have, and it has been satisfactory." Then, the company has contracted the whole of its teaming to Beddoe at Pilcher for the year at 71 cents the hundred, Shand said. "You cannot do it at 71 cents. I know what your outfit costs you to run, because I have the figures in the drawer under my hand. I am not asking you to do it at 71 cents. I am telling you the work is let." There was a long moment then, and Alta Vance did something in that moment that she thought about many times afterward, which was that she asked a question instead of making a speech. "Why 71? Shand looked up at her, and for the first time in the interview he appeared to be interested. "Because in September this camp gets a spur off the main line," he said. "Rail to the tipple. After that there is no hauling in Ammon County worth the name, and Beddoe knows it, and Beddoe is buying a year of business at a loss to be the last teamster standing when the smoke clears. He has money behind him, and you have not. That is not cruelty, Mrs. Vance. That is the shape of the thing. In 5 years there will not be a freight wagon making a living between here and the Sweetwater, and the reason will be that a locomotive does not eat when it is not working, and a horse does. A locomotive doesn't get you off the Kelso in the mud, either. It will not have to," Shand said. "That is the entire point. Steam does not get tired, and it does not get sick, and it does not have to be fed on the days it sits, and the men who understand that in 1886 are going to own this country in 1896. And the men who are still standing at the head of a horse explaining what a horse can do are going to be telling that story to somebody in a chair. I am sorry about it. I am not sorry enough to lose the company money over it. The note came due on the 1st of April. She could not pay it. On the 5th the company took judgment. On the 8th they appraised her, and the whole of it, start to finish, was as clean and as legal and as free of malice as a column of figures, which is why it was so hard to fight, and why it hurt in a place that anger could not reach. Riding home from that March interview, Alta had stopped her horse on the rise above Sink Creek, where you can see the whole of her place at once, the low sod-roofed barn, the wagon shed, the corrals, the creek going through in a green line, and she had sat there a good while in the cold, with her hands crossed on the horn. And down in the horse pasture, alone, out at the far east corner where the old snubbing post stood, the livered chestnut mare was doing what she did every day of her life, which was walking. Not grazing, walking, around and around the post, to the left, always to the left, in a track she had worn into the sod so deep and so smooth that by that spring you could see it from the rise like a ring drawn on the ground with a stick. 42 paces around, bare in the middle of March when everything else was coming green. Every man who had ever leaned on Alta Vance's fence had seen that ring. And every one of them had said the same thing about it. They said the mare was crazy. Maud came to her on the 11th of October, 1884, at the tail end of a livery clean-out sale in the alley behind Ort Beddoes' barn in Pilcher, and she came for $4, because nobody else in the alley would give $1.50. Alta had not gone there to buy a horse. She had gone to buy a pair of wheel collars and a keg of axle grease. And she had stopped at the back of the crowd, because there is not a person raised around stock who can walk past a sale ring without looking, and she had watched Beddoes' man run through the leavings. A pony with a bowed tendon, a little pair of Spanish mules, a broken-down chuck outfit with a warped bed. And then 2 of them led out the mare. It took 2 of them, because she did not want to come. She was not fighting. That was the thing Alta noticed and could not stop noticing. A horse that fights a lead rope is doing something everybody in that alley understood, and there would have been jokes and a few dollars might have moved. This mare was not fighting. She came out to the end of the rope and stopped and set herself, all 4 feet, quiet as a church, and looked back down the alley at the post she had been tied to, and would not walk forward, and when the second man got a hand in her halter and turned her head, she came around like a gate and stood again, and looked back at the post. "Anybody wants a windsucker," said Beddoes' man. He walked her up to the rail and set her teeth on it for the crowd, which is a thing you can do with a bad cribber if you know where to press, and the mare put her top teeth on the wood and arched her neck and drew. And the sound came up out of her, that long, low pull, part grunt and part sigh, like somebody drawing a cork in the next room. The alley laughed. It is a genuinely funny noise the first time you hear it, and men laughed. And one of them said something about his brother-in-law, and Ort Beddoes himself came out from under the awning and gave the little speech he had given about that mare 4 times already that fall. There she is, gentlemen, sound as $1 everywhere but her head. She will chew your rail, she will chew your manger, she will chew your wagon tongue. She will swallow more air in a day than a blacksmith's bellows, and there is not a thing in this world you can do about it but sell her to a man you don't like. Warranty of soundness? Not in this territory, not in any territory. A crib biter is unsound in law, and I will say so in front of the judge. Somebody give me $2 for the meat of her. Nobody gave him $2. And Alta Vance, who had $19 in her pocket for collars and grease, and who had been a widow for a year and 8 months, and who had exactly no business buying anything, stood at the back of that crowd, looking at the mare's shoulders. There were 2 circles of white hair on them, one each side, high up, over the points, the size of a saucer. The hair grown back in white the way hair does over an old pressure sore that is healed clean. Alta had seen that mark her whole life. Every freighter's kid has seen it. It is what a collar leaves on a horse that is worn one hard for years and years, and it is not a mark of abuse particularly. It is a mark of work, and you see it on wheelers and on plow horses and on the kind of animal a family keeps for 15 years and cries over. And the mare was 12 or 13, and had the hind end and the shoulder and the flat bone of something bred to lean into a load. And she was standing in an alley in Pilcher, Wyoming territory, in October, with a rope on her, waiting for the next thing, and the whole world had decided in the space of about 4 minutes that the sum total of her was a noise. $4, Alta said. Everybody turned around. "Ma'am," said Beddoes' man, kindly, "she's a windsucker. I heard you the first 3 times. $4. You understand there's no warranty." "I understand there's no warranty on anything," Alta said. $4. She led the mare home 9 miles, and the mare walked at her shoulder the whole way without a word of trouble, and did not set her teeth on anything once, and every quarter mile or so she put her nose down and blew at the ground the way horses do when they are working out where they are. Alta named her Maud that night in the barn, because the name was plain and short, and because she had decided on the road that she was not going to call an animal by a thing that was wrong with it. Now here is the part that everybody in Ammon County got wrong for the next 20 months, and it is worth being careful about, because it is the whole hinge of what happened later. Maud did crib. She cribbed all winter. She set her teeth on the top rail of the corral and pulled air, and the second week Alta caught her at the manger and moved the manger, and she caught her at the wagon tongue and stood the tongue up, and she tried the two things everybody tries, which are a strap around the throat and a coat of tar on the wood, and the strap made the mare miserable, and did not stop her, and the tar did not stop her either. And after about a month Alta Vance did something that nobody else in that country would have done, which was that she quit trying to stop her and started watching her instead. Because there was a pattern in it. There was such a pattern in it that once Alta saw it she could not unsee it, and it kept her awake. Maud did not crib on anything at any height. She would not touch the bottom rail. She would not touch the manger after the first week, and she never touched a tree or the barn door or the wagon box. What she wanted was a rail that was round, or nearly round, and that stood about as high as the point of her own shoulder. And once she had one, she took hold of it out at the very end of her reach, with her neck stretched, not tucked, and she pulled. And then she took one step, to the left, and then she did it again, a little further along, and again. And she would go all the way around a round corral like that, 10 or 12 minutes at a time, hand over hand you would almost say, teeth and step, always to the left, and at the end of it she would stand and shake herself, and go back to her hay perfectly content. And there was not one thing wrong with her digestion, or her flesh, or her wind, in flat contradiction of everything Ort Beto had said in the alley. And out in the pasture, where there was no rail at all, she walked. Around the old snubbing post at the east corner. To the left. In a circle. Alta paced it out in the spring of 1885. It was 42 paces around, near enough to a 42-foot circle, and the mare had worn it down through the sod to the gravel, and she walked it most days for a spell in the morning, and a spell before dark, and a steady flat-footed walk that never varied and never hurried, and when she came off it, she was neither sweated nor breathing hard. And she had that settled look about her that an animal gets after it has done something. Eb Nance said the mare was touched. Wesley's old neighbor Hollis Deal, who came by twice a year for salt, said he had seen a horse do that once after a bad lightning storm, and it never came right. The Verity teamsters said she was a merry-go-round. Cordelia Shand, who ran the boarding house at the camp and who had never been within 200 yards of the animal, told a table of 9 men that the Vance woman had bought a mad horse and talked to it, which by the time it came back around to Alta had become the Vance woman keeps a mad horse and prays over it, and by the second telling after that had become something considerably less kind than either. And Alta Vance, who did not have the least idea in the world what she was looking at, who guessed at boredom, who guessed at some old habit from a stall, who once wondered out loud to a horse in an empty barn whether she was walking off a grief of her own, Alta Vance did the only useful thing available to her, which was that she hitched the mare. She put Maud in the wheel of a 4-horse team in the March mud of 1885 with 4,200 pounds of pump timber behind her, on the Kelso grade, in the dark, and found out in about 20 minutes that she had bought, for $4, the finest harness horse she had ever had her hands on in her life. She told exactly one person. She was not a fool. The one person she told was Rafe Odom, and she did not tell him so much as failed to prevent him from finding out. Rafe Odom was the company blacksmith at Verity, 36 years old, from Ohio by way of 4 other places, a wide, quiet man who had a way of finishing a sentence about 3 days after he started it. He shod for the mine and for anybody who came. And he had shod Alta's horses since 1883 and had never once, in 3 years, given her a price different from the price he gave a man. That sounds like nothing. In that country, in those years, it was not nothing, and Alta had noticed it the first month and had never said a word about it to him or to anybody. In April of 1885, he had come out to Sink Creek to reset shoes all around, and he had picked up Maud's near fore and held it a while and set it down, and picked up the off fore and held that one longer. And then he had straightened up with his hands on the small of his back and looked at the mare for what Alta afterward estimated was the better part of a minute. "Something wrong?" she said. "No, Rafe, her feet wear crooked," he said. "Outsides of the 2 lefts, insides of the 2 rights. Even, same on all 4. He thought about it. That's not a horse walking wrong. That's a horse walking a circle. For years. She walks a circle in the pasture. I know it. Whole county knows it. He put his hammer down. That's not why. She had that wear on her the day you brought her home, and she'd only had 2 weeks of your pasture. And then, because he was Rafe Odom and had used up his allotment of words for the morning, he had picked up the next foot and said nothing further about it for 14 months. So there were 2 people in Ammon County who knew the mare was not what Ort Beto said she was. One of them was a widow nobody would listen to. The other was a blacksmith who did not talk. Now it was April of 1886, and Alta had 90 days. She went and asked for work like a person going door to door. That is not a figure of speech either. She rode into Pilcher on the 12th, and again on the 19th, and again on the 26th, and she asked at the mercantile, and at the 2 saloons, and at the freight barn, and at the lumber yard. And she rode 30 miles south to the Hollis Deal place, and 22 miles north to the Tandy Brothers. And she stood in front of men she had known for 7 years, with her hat in her hand, in the figurative sense, and her chin up in the literal one, and she asked whether there was anything to move. What she got was this. She got a load of cedar posts for deal at $6. She got 2 loads of hay to the Tandys at $4 the load. She got a piano moved 11 miles for a widow at Pilcher, who paid her in cash and apologized for the amount. She got the stone for a well curb. In 7 weeks of asking, she took in $61 and some odd cents against a debt of $680, and every man who turned her down was decent about it, and most of them were sorry, and every one of them said some version of the same thing, which was that Beto had the company work now, and there was not enough left over in that county to keep a second outfit in shoes. Meanwhile, 4 miles east of Pilcher, the Verity Coal and Coke Company was having the best spring in its history. You have to see the camp to understand the rest of it. It sat in a shallow saucer of shortgrass, with the shale dumps on the north side going gray to black, and there were 60-odd houses of 1 room and 2, and a company store, and Cordelia Shand's boarding house, and a wash house, and 140 men working when the work was full. And in the middle of it stood the headframe of the number 2, 44 feet of squared timber with the sheave wheels at the top, and under the headframe was the shaft, 216 feet to the bottom, sunk in 2 compartments, the hoisting compartment where the cage ran, and beside it the manway, where the ladders went down in flights with landings every 20 feet, the way out for a man on his own 2 legs. And in the engine house beside it, on a bed of 8x8 timbers bolted through to a stone footing, was the thing Merritt Shand loved. It was a double-drum hoisting engine, second-hand out of a played-out gold property in Colorado, 60 horsepower, with a steam boiler and a governor and a brake band as wide as a man's hand. And it had come in on 14 wagons in the fall of 1884, and had cost the company, with the freight and the setting, something north of $4,000, and Merritt Shand had personally overseen the leveling of the bedplate with a spirit level and a hair. It would raise a loaded cage 216 feet in 40 seconds. It ran on 11 tons of the company's own coal a month, which cost the company nothing. And it did not eat on Sundays, and the man who ran it was named Tobe Quimby and had a chair. The whim that had raised the number 1 out of the ground for 5 years before it, standing abandoned 600 yards to the west, over a shaft nobody had used since 1884, was 20 feet of arm and a wooden drum and about $40 of second growth timber, and Merritt Shand had not looked at it in 2 years. On the 21st of May, Alta got a haul. It came to her the way the last of anything comes, which is because nobody else wanted it. The company needed 40 sets of pump timber and 900 feet of 6-inch plank taken from the mill at Corliss Springs over the Kelso grade to the camp, and Ort Beddoe had priced it and had then discovered, as Ort Beddoe was always discovering, that the mud on the north face of the Kelso in the 3rd week of May is a thing you cannot price on paper. He had put 2 outfits at it on the 18th, and both of them had come back down. One of them had lost a wagon over the edge at the second switchback and killed nothing but a set of harness, and after that his teamsters had a meeting in the barn and came to a conclusion. So on the 20th, Ort Beddoe rode out to Sink Creek, and he sat his horse in Alta Vance's yard and would not get down, and he made her the offer with the particular sourness of a man doing something he has sworn not to do. 40 sets of timber and the plank, Corliss to the camp, over the Kelso. $60 the trip, and there's 3 trips in it. $180. Alta stood in the door with a dish towel in her hands and did not answer for a moment. "You couldn't get it up," she said. "I could get it up in July. They need it in May. Do you want the work, or do you want to stand there enjoying yourself?" $240, Alta said. Beddoe's face did an interesting thing. $240 for the 3, and I use my own harness and I pick my own days, she said. Or you can go tell Merritt Shand that Ammon County has run out of teamsters, and I'll be here. He took it. He sat up there another 20 seconds working his jaw, and then he said a word he should not have said in a woman's yard, and he took it. And he rode off, and Eb Nance came around the corner of the barn, where he had been standing the whole time with a currycomb in his hand, and said, "240. 240, Alta said. Her hands were shaking a little on the dish towel, and she folded it so he would not see. "Go get Maud in." The Kelso grade goes up out of the Corliss bottom in 4 switchbacks and comes over a saddle at about 7,300 feet and then drops down the north face toward the camp in one long sidling pitch, 1.25 miles of it, with the hill on your left and nothing at all on your right. Going up is a question of horses. Coming down is a question of holding, and holding is a different trade entirely, and it is the trade that kills teamsters. A loaded wagon on a grade does not want to be pulled. It wants to run. What keeps it off the horses in front of it is the brake, which is a block of wood on an iron rod that a driver screws down with a lever until it smokes, and the britchen, which is the broad leather strap that goes around the haunches of the wheel horses, so that when the wagon shoves, it shoves against them. The wheelers hold the whole world back with their hind ends. A wheel horse that will sit into a britchen and stay there, steady, all the way down a mile of sidling road, without braking, without hurrying, without one moment of panic when the load comes on hard, is not a common animal. Alta's father had told her when she was 11 years old that there are 10 horses that can pull for every one that can hold, and that a man who has a holder ought to be quiet about it. She hooked Maud in the near wheel. They loaded at Corliss Springs on the 23rd of May in the dark, 6 horses, 6,800 pounds, and they were over the saddle by 10 in the morning, with the horses blowing and the road above them cut to soup by 2 failed outfits and a week of afternoon rain. Eb rode the off-wheeler and Alta drove. And at the top of the north face she stopped the team and set the brake and got down, and walked back along the whole string, touching every horse, and then she got up on the seat and took the lines and said, quietly, The way you do. All right. What happened over the next hour and 10 minutes was the reason Rafe Odom later said the thing he said in front of 9 men. The road was greasy, and the wagon slewed twice on the sidling, and the near front wheel went into a wallow at the second bend, and came out of it hard, and the whole load shifted 3 inches, and the tongue kicked, and any one of those things is where a green wheeler goes to pieces. Maud did not go to pieces. Maud sat down into the britchen and leaned back into 800 pounds of pump timber, like a woman leaning into a wind, and she held, and she kept holding, and when the load surged, she took the surge on her hocks and gave 2 inches and took it back, and she did not once try to hurry out from under it, and she did not once try to get sideways to it, and she did it, going to the left down that whole 1.25 miles, and her ears never went back one time. They came into Verity at 20 minutes past 11 with 6,800 pounds and every hoof sound. There were maybe 20 men around the tipple who watched them come in off the north face, because word had gone around the camp that the Vance woman was trying the Kelso with a load, and there is nothing a mining camp likes better than a chance to watch somebody fail at something in daylight. 2 of Beddoes' teamsters were standing at the store steps. Tobe Quimby had come out of the engine house. Rafe Odom was in the door of the shop with the shoe and the tongs, and he stayed there, and he did not go back in. Nobody cheered. Men in that country did not cheer a wagon. But the 2 teamsters at the store steps stopped talking, and one of them looked at the other one, and then looked at the road behind the wagon, and then went inside, and that is closer to an ovation than most people ever get. Alta made the second trip on the 27th and the third on the 1st of June, and Ort Beddoe paid her $240 in the freight barn at Pilcher, counting it out in silver and small bills onto the top of a flour barrel and taking a receipt. And Alta walked out of that barn with the most money she had held in her hands at one time in 3 years, and she took $180 of it straight up the street to the Verity Company office and put it against the note. The clerk wrote it in the book. The balance came down to $500. She was 36 days from the sale, and she needed $500. And she had just proved that she could earn $240 in 9 days if somebody would let her, and there was not one more haul like it left in Ammon County, and the spur was coming in September, and everybody in the room, including Alta Vance, knew all 3 of those things at the same time. Merritt Shand came out of his office while she was standing at the counter. He looked at the entry in the book upside down, and he looked at her, and he said, without any edge in it at all, that was well done. On the Kelso. I heard about it. Thank you. It does not change the arithmetic. I know what it doesn't change. Mrs. Vance. He stopped and adjusted something on the counter that did not need adjusting. There is a house in Rawlins that takes boarders, and I know the woman who runs it. I am prepared to write a letter. I would rather do that than watch this go the way it is going to go. And Alta Vance said, I have got 36 days, Mr. Shand, and I have not spent them yet. She went out. It was on the way home from that, on the 2nd of June, that she took the west road out of the camp instead of the south road, because the south road was cut up and because she did not want to ride past the boarding house, and the west road goes out past the number 1. There is not much left of an abandoned shaft after 2 years. The headframe was down. The engine house was down. What stood was a stone chimney and a fenced hole with a plank cap over it, and a pump house with a stovepipe, and beside the pump house, on a level pad of ground about 60 feet across, stood a thing that Alta Vance had ridden past 100 times and had never once looked at directly. It was a heavy upright post 15 feet high, standing in a stone-filled crib, with a wooden drum 8 feet across built around it like a barrel, and out of the drum, at about the height of a horse's shoulder, ran a squared arm 20 feet long with a worn iron ring bolted through it near the end. From the drum, a rusted wire rope ran off over a set of timbers toward the capped shaft, and there was 400 feet of it, and around the whole thing, in the grass, was a ring worn down to the gravel, where something had gone around and around and around to the left for 5 years. Alta had stopped her horse in the road before she knew she had done it. She sat there, in the wind, with the meadowlarks going, and she looked at that ring in the grass, and she thought about another ring in the grass 6 miles south at the east corner of her own horse pasture, 42 paces around, worn down to the gravel, and about how she had measured it with her own 2 feet in the spring of 1885, and had never once thought to go and measure this one. Behind the pump house, an old man in a canvas coat came out with a bucket, saw her sitting there in the road, and stood still. His name was Jory Trewin, and he was 68 years old, and he was Cornish, out of a parish near Camborne, and he had come to America in 1856, and had been underground or on top of a shaft ever since, and he was the last man the Verity Coal and Coke Company still paid to be at the number 1. He kept the pump going, because a shaft that fills up is a shaft you never open again. And the company was not ready to say that out loud about the number 1, and so for 2 years an old man had walked out there every day and oiled a pump and swept a house nobody entered. "You want water," he said. "There's the bucket. I want to know what that is." He looked where she was pointing, and then he looked back at her, and something went across his face that she could not read at the time, and understood completely about 10 minutes later. "That's the whim," he said. She got down. He told it the way an old man tells a thing he has told nobody in 2 years. A whim is how you get coal and men and water out of a shaft before somebody buys you an engine. You set a king post in a crib of stone, and you build a drum around it 8 feet through, and you run your rope from the drum out over a sheave at the shaft mouth, and you hang a kibble on the end of it, which is an iron bucket that a man can ride in standing up with his hands on the chain. Then you hitch a horse to an arm 20 feet long, and the horse walks a circle, and the drum turns. And the rope wins, and the bucket comes up out of the ground at about the speed of a man climbing stairs. How much can it lift? "Him at the number 1, Jory Trewin said. "Half a ton and easy. A man's nothing. A man is 160 pound, and the kibble is 90. A pair could raise from 300 foot all day. We were only ever down 190 here." He wiped his hands on the canvas coat. "Slow. That's all the wrong with a whim. She's slow. Engine does in 40 seconds what a horse wants 9 minutes for. But she wants no coal and no water and no fireman and no boiler inspector, and she does not stop of a Sunday, and she does not break in a way a man cannot mend with a rope and an axe." "How many horses did you keep?" 2. A pair. Boxer and Queen. Alta said, carefully, "What became of them?" "Boxer went down in the winter of '83, and we buried him back of the dump. Queen they sold off in July of '84 when the engine came, with the mules and the tools and the office stove. $11 they got for her." He said the number the way a man says a number he has carried around. $11. And she was the best animal I ever had my hands on in 40 years of shafts, and I will say that to the superintendent's face, and I have. Why 11? Because she'd got a habit on her. Jory Trewin looked out at the ring in the grass. Crib biting, they call it. She'd take hold of the arm with her teeth and pull the air down her and grunt, and step off left, and that was her way of starting. I never cured her of it, and I never tried. I'd ring the bell for a lift, and she'd have hold of that arm before I'd got my hand off the rope. Alta Vance stood in the road at the number 1 and heard the blood go in her own ears. "Mr. Trewin," she said, "how long is that arm?" 20 foot. So how far around does a horse walk? 2 and 40 pace, said Jory Trewin. I've walked it beside her 10,000 times. She did not trust herself to say anything else. She got on her horse and rode the 6 miles to Sink Creek at a long trot the whole way, and Eb Nance came out of the barn and saw her face and said, "What?" And she said, "Nothing. Get the good halter." She brought Maud to the number 1 at 8 the next morning, on the 3rd of June, leading her, walking the whole 6 miles beside her, the way she had the first day. Jory Trewin came out of the pump house with a tin cup in his hand and got about 4 steps into the yard and stopped, and stood there, and did not move, and the cup went down slowly, and hung at the end of his arm. Then he said one word, in a voice that had gone completely to pieces. "Queen," and the mare's head came up off the end of the lead rope, and both ears came forward, and she took 2 steps toward that old man and stopped, and stood looking at him, and made a small sound in her nose that Alta Vance had never heard her make in 20 months. He came across the yard. He put both hands flat on her shoulders, one on each white saucer, and stood there with his head down for a while, and Alta looked at the sky and let him have it. Then he did what an old horseman does, which is that he got practical, because being practical is how you keep from crying in front of a woman. "Open," he said, and put his thumb in the corner of the mare's mouth, and she opened. And he pulled the lip back off her top front teeth. There, you see that. Alta had seen that mouth 100 times. She had never once had it explained to her. A crib biter, Jory Trewin said, wears the front teeth off flat and even, all 6 top and bottom, because they take hold of any old thing at any old height and haul. Look at this mouth. She's worn on the top 6 and nothing on the bottom, and she's worn 'em to a slope, and the slope runs one way. He turned the mare's head so Alta could see it in the light. She's took hold of a thing that was round and always at the same height, and she's always pulled off it in the same direction, and she has done it that way 10 times a day for 5 years. That's not a vice missus, that's wear. That is the same wear as a rope on a sheave. You'd have to be a fool to read it any other way, and the reason every man in this county has read it the other way is that they've none of them ever stood on a whim. He let go of her lip and put the heel of his hand on her near shoulder. "And there's your collar. Whim collar sits high, and it sits still. Because she's not pulling forward against it like a wagon horse, she's leaning into it going around. Always the one way. Rubs a saucer on both sides. You show me a horse with 2 round white patches high on the shoulder and crooked wear on all 4 feet and a 2 40 pace ring wore in a pasture, and I'll tell you what she is without looking at her head." "They put $1 on her," Alta said, "in April. On my corral post." Jory Trewin turned around and looked at her. "Company paid $140 for this mare at Laramie in May of 1879, he said. She was rising 7. I have got the book on the shelf in there with it wrote down, because I wrote it down. 140. And they sold her for 11, and somebody sold her to you for 4, and now they've put $1 on her." He shook his head slowly. "Same mare the whole time. Not one thing about her changed but who was looking." He went in and got the book, and it was a cheap black stock ledger with a broken spine, and he found the page with a thumb that shook a little, and Alta Vance read the entry in her own hands. May 1879. Bought, Laramie, 1 mare, chestnut, rising 7, for whim. $140. And underneath it, in the same hand, 5 years later, July 1884. Sold camp sale. 1 mare, chestnut, whim, windsucker. $11. She stood there in the sun, holding a dead company's stockbook, with a woman's whole life in it, and behind her, at the end of a lead rope in a yard she had not stood in for 22 months, Maud walked forward until she was standing on her own ring in the grass, and set her feet, and waited to be told. She went to Mare on the 5th of June, and she took Jory Trewin with her, and she made the best case of her life, and it was the worst thing she ever did. She had thought it out for 2 nights. She did not go in and tell him he had priced a $140 whim horse at $1, because Merritt Shand was not a man who could be shamed into anything, and she knew it. She went in with a proposition, and she laid it on his desk in that flat voice of hers with the numbers in order. The number 2 went down 216 feet in 2 compartments. One held the cage and the rope, the other held the ladders. Everything a man at the bottom of that shaft had between himself and the sky was in those 2 compartments, and both of them ran through the same 216 feet of ground, and the ground at the 90-foot level was a run of soft stuff that had been timbered twice already, and had a name among the men, who called it the porridge. "You have one way up and one way out," Alta said, "and they are in the same hole. Put a whim over the manway at the number 2. The gear is standing at the number 1 doing nothing. Mr. Trewin can set it in 3 days. I will keep 2 horses at that camp and a man on them at $2 the day, and if you never use it once in 10 years, you will have spent about what you spend on lamp oil. And if we do use it," Shand said, "then you will be glad." Shand sat back. He was not angry. That was somehow much worse. He looked at Jory Trewin, who had his hat in both hands, and he looked at Alta Vance in her blue dress with her chin up, and he was, in his own estimation, being asked to spend money he did not have to spend by a woman who needed it very badly. And there is nothing in this world harder to hear than a good idea from a person you have already decided to be sorry for. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "in 40 seconds, that engine puts a cage on the collar from the bottom. If the engine stops, we fix the engine. If the engine cannot be fixed, we send to Rollins by wire, and they put a machinist on the cars, and he is here inside a day and a half, and in the meanwhile the men walk up the ladders, which is what ladders are for. You are proposing that this company pays $60 a month in perpetuity to keep a horse standing next to a modern hoisting plant on the chance that the 19th century comes back. I am proposing you keep a second rope on a hole with 140 men in it. I have a second rope. It is called a ladder. And if the ladders go, then something has happened that no whim in the world was going to fix either," Shand said. And he stood up, which ended it. She was at the door when he said the rest of it, and he did not say it to be cruel. That was the thing she came to believe afterward, and never entirely forgave him for. He said it the way a man says a thing that has just occurred to him. "Trewin, that gear at the number 1. It is standing on company ground doing nothing, and I have been buying second growth lagging at Corliss at $14 the thousand. Take it down. The drum timber and the arm and the post will cut for lagging, and the rope can go to the scrap man with the boiler tubes. Have it down by the 12th. Jory Trewin said, "Sir." By the 12th Trewin, they walked out into the sun, and neither of them said anything for a while, and then Jory Trewin, who was 68, and who had walked 42 paces beside a mare 10,000 times, said, "Well, that was my doing as much as yours," which was a lie, and a kind one. Alta Vance rode home, and sat on the step until dark. On the morning of the 8th of June, she rode back to the camp and went into the company office and asked Merritt Shand's clerk what the company wanted for the whim gear at the number 1 as it stood. The clerk went and asked. He came back and said the superintendent said it was junk, and that if she wanted it, she could have the whole of it for $3 and haul it herself, and that it had to be off company ground by the 12th. She paid the $3. It took her 2 days and 4 horses and 3 trips, and Rafe Odom shut the shop at noon both days, and came out and did not ask permission from anybody, and Jory Trewin marked every piece with chalk before it came down. A Roman numeral on each timber, and a matching one on the piece it went against. The way a man marks a barn frame he intends to raise again. The king post was 15 feet of squared fir and green enough yet to be heavy. The drum came apart in 8 staves and 2 heads. The arm was 1 stick, 20 feet, with the iron ring bolted through it, and the wood polished at that ring like the handle of an old axe. And the rope was 400 feet of 7/8 wire, stiff as a fence, weighing about 240 pounds, and they laid it out in a coil in the wagon bed like something asleep. Eb Nance said, "On the second evening, Alta, we got 29 days, and you spent $3 and 4 days of horsework on a merry-go-round." "I know what I did. What are we going to do with it?" Alta Vance looked out at the 4 pieces of it lying in her yard in the last of the light, and she said, "We are going to stand it up." They stood it up between the 10th and the 13th of June, in the flat piece of ground north of her barn, where the corral had been before Wesley moved it, and it took the 4 of them, Jory Trewin directing, and Rafe Odom doing the ironwork, and Eb Nance up the pole, and Alta on the lines with 2 horses. And on the afternoon of the 13th, the drum turned for the first time in 22 months, and made a sound like a ship. Then Alta backed Maud into the arm and buckled a whim collar on her, and Jory Trewin stood at her head and said, "Come up, Queen," and the mare set her teeth on the arm and pulled a long draught of air, and stepped off to the left. She did not need to be led. She did not need to be driven. She went around and around at that flat, unvarying walk, and Rafe Odom, holding a wrench he had forgotten he was holding, watched a horse that a county had priced at $1 wind 400 feet of wire rope onto a drum in 9.5 minutes without one word from a human being. They used it for hay. That was all there was to use it for, on a horse ranch with no shaft. They rigged a fork and a track into the loft, and Maud raised the whole of Alta's first cutting into the barn in an afternoon, which was work that ordinarily cost Alta 3 days and a man's back, and then they used it to pull 4 cottonwood stumps out of the creek bank, and then there was nothing more it could lift. Word got to Pilcher by the 15th, the way things do. They called it the Vance merry-go-round. Ort Beddoe told the story in the freight barn with the actions. Cordelia Shand told a table of 9 men that the Vance woman had spent her last dollars on a contraption to amuse a mad horse, and that it was a mercy, in a way, that the sale was coming, because the poor creature had plainly gone past helping. 2 of Beddoe's teamsters rode 9 miles out of their way on a Sunday to look at it from the road, and sat their horses at her gate laughing, and Alta Vance came out on the step with a dish towel and stood there until they left. She had 22 days. Deputy Sheriff Lyle Pardee came out to Sink Creek on the morning of the 16th of June, with an order of the district court in his hatband, and Ort Beddoe riding half a length behind him, and he took her horses. He hated it. He said so twice, badly. Under the order, the sheriff took possession of the appraised property in advance of the sale, because the judgment creditor had represented to the court that the property was being worked hard on mountain roads and might be wasted before the 7th of July, which was true, and which was the only reason Alta Vance had made $240 in 9 days, and there is a particular kind of joke in that which she did not find funny for about 2 years afterward. So they haltered them in the yard, and Eb Nance held the gate with his jaw set, and Bird and Pet and Ruby and Jip went out through it, and the brown gelding with the splint, and the 3 saddle horses, and the 4 assorted pullers, and the wagons went behind them on their own wheels, with the harness in the beds. Beddoe sat his horse and counted them off out loud against the sheet. Then he got to the bottom of the sheet and said, "And the windsucker." "That's $1, Pardee said. "She's on the list. She's $1, Ort. I am not driving $1 9 miles in this heat and boarding it in your corrals at 15 cents a day for 21 days at the county's expense so it can be knocked down for $1. It comes off." He looked at Alta, and there was nothing in his face but tiredness. "Ma'am, the mare stays." And the boy's buckskin comes off too. I've put it in writing this time. Ort Beddoe argued about it for 4 minutes. Lyle Pardee let him, and then said Ort once, and that was the end of it. And they took 13 head and 3 wagons, and a set of chain harness with the tugs spliced twice out through the gate and down the Pilcher Road. And the dust went up and drifted east and thinned out and was gone. Alta Vance stood in her yard and watched her life go down the road at a walk, and it took a long time, because horses at a walk take a long time. Then it was very quiet. You do not know how much noise 13 horses make until they are gone. The pasture was empty. The water trough had nothing at it. The corral rails, which had been chewed and rubbed and leaned on for 9 years, stood there in the sun, holding nothing back from nothing. And the flies came into the barn, because there was no tail moving anywhere to keep them out. And the whole place made a sound Alta had never heard it make in the 7 years she had lived on it, which was no sound at all. Eb Nance sat down on the water trough and cried, at 20 years old, with his hat in his hands, and Alta went into the house so that he could do it in private. She got out the coffee tin. There was $61 in it, and the $61 was every haul she had scratched up in 10 weeks of asking, and she had $500 to find, and 21 days to find it, and she had no horses to earn it with, and no wagon to earn it in. She sat down at the table with a sheet of paper. She got as far as Dear Mrs. Ferris Merritt Shand had said there was a house in Rawlins that took boarders, and that the woman who ran it was a friend of his. And Alta Vance sat in her own kitchen on the evening of the 16th of June, 1886, and wrote 3 words of a letter, asking a stranger whether there was work in her kitchen for a woman of 31 with a strong back, and no references but a dead husband's name. And she put the pen down, and she reached into the pocket of the blue dress hanging on the back of the door, and she took out an 1881 silver dollar worn smooth on the high points, and set it on the table beside the paper, and looked at it for a long time. There is a version of this story where that is where it ends. It is worth being honest about that. She was not clever enough to invent a way out of $500 in 21 days. Because there was not one, and nothing she had done, not the Kelso, not the $240, not the Mare, not the whim standing out there in the dark north of the barn with the dew coming down on it, none of it was going to add up in time. And she knew it. She was not saved by being right. Being right had already been tried. What she did instead was what she had done for 3 years, which was that she got up the next morning and worked. There was 1 horse and 1 mare on the Vance place, and one of them was Eb's saddle horse, and so on the 17th of June Alta Vance and Eb Nance began putting up the second cutting of hay on 40 acres with a mare and a whim, because Maud could lift with the fork what 4 men could not. And hay was the one thing left on that ground that had value, and if she was going to lose the place on the 7th of July, she was going to lose it with the loft full, because that is who she was. Jory Trewin walked out from the number 1 on the Sunday and helped, and would not take anything for it. Rafe Odom came Saturday evening on his own horse with a sack of shoes and a rasp, and looked at Maud's feet, and did not charge her, and stayed to supper, and after supper the 2 of them stood at the corral in the dark for about 20 minutes, and said perhaps 30 words between them, and one of the things he said was, "I put a bid in my head for the 7th. For the 4 mares. I got $130 saved. Rafe, I'd hold 'em for you. You'd lose your money." "I'd have 4 good mares," Rafe Odom said, "which is what I'd have." And Alta Vance, who had not put her hand on another human being on purpose since February of 1883, put her hand flat on the back of his and left it there for about 3 seconds, and then took it away and said good night, and went into the house. That was the 19th. On the 24th of June, 1886, at 22 minutes past 10 in the morning, on a clear, windless Thursday, with the short grass gone golden and the heat already standing on the shale dumps, 90 feet down the shaft of the Verity No. 2, the ground the men called the porridge came in. There was no warning that anybody afterward could agree on. Two men on the collar said the ground talked for about 4 seconds, which is a thing that ground does, a sound like a wagon going over a plank bridge a long way off. Then 60 feet of the shaft's soft ground let go at once. It came into the manway compartment, and it took the ladders with it. 3 flights and their landings, oak and pine, bolted to the shaft timbers, went down into the bottom of that shaft in a column of shale and water and broken wood, and what was left behind at the 90-foot level was 20 feet of raw sloughing ground with not a stick of timber in it, that ran a little more every time a man put a light on it. It crowded the hoisting compartment, too. It bent the cage guides in over the road, and it drove a corner of the cage into them and set it fast, and the cage was at the bottom, and 216 feet up in the daylight, the rope hung slack over the sheave wheel like a fishing line with nothing on it. Tobe Quimby had been in the engine house since 6 o'clock. He felt the floor go, and he was on his feet before the dust came out of the headframe. And he did the thing that any hoisting engineer in the world would have done, which was that he took hold of the lever and tried to bring the cage up. It did not come. He gave it more steam. It did not come. He gave it everything the boiler had, and at 31 minutes past 10 in the morning, with the brake off and the throttle wide, the wrought iron drum shaft of the Verity Coal and Coke Company's 60-horsepower double-drum hoisting engine sheared through at the keyway, with a report that people heard in Pilcher 4 miles away, and the drum went over sideways off its pillow block and tore out the far end of the bedplate, and Tobe Quimby was thrown against the wall and got up with a broken collarbone and 11 men still underneath him. The second drum was empty. Its rope had been unrooved 3 weeks before because it was condemned by wear, and the new one was ordered, and the new one was in a freight car somewhere between Omaha and Rawlins. At 5 minutes past 11, they got an answer on the standing pipe. A man on the collar hit the pump column with a hammer and counted, and 216 feet down a man hit it back, and the count came up 11, and then it came up 11 again, and the whole camp made a sound that was not a cheer and was not anything else either. 11 men, all of them alive, all of them in the west entry, which was 14 feet above the bottom, which was filling, because the fall had smashed the pump column and choked the sump, and the water in a coal shaft comes up whether anybody has an opinion about it or not. And the air was going wrong, slowly, because the same fall had half stopped the upcast, and black damp is patient. They had, by Gus Hovden's estimate, signaled up on the pipe in the crudest arithmetic ever done in that county. Something between 12 and 16 hours. And the Verity Coal and Coke Company, which had the best hoisting plant in Ammon County, had no way to put a rope down its own hole. They tried. Do not think they did not try. 20 men went into the manway from the top, with a hand windlass and a bucket and a load of lagging boards, working down toward the 90 to crib and plank the raw place, so that anything lowered past it afterward would come through instead of being buried, and they made 40 feet in the first hour, and had to come out twice when the ground ran again. And the carpenter shop spliced together every foot of rope in the camp, which came to 260 feet of manila of 4 sizes, and would not have held a man's weight at the joins. Somebody suggested the well rope from the boarding house. Somebody suggested going down the old number 1 and driving 600 yards through solid ground, and a man from the day shift laughed at him for it, and then apologized, because everybody was past themselves by then. Merritt Shan stood at the shaft collar in his black coat with his hat in his hand and gave orders in a voice that got quieter and quieter, and at 20 minutes past 11 Jory Truen came across the 600 yards from the number 1 at the fastest walk a 68-year-old man can make and got hold of his sleeve. "You want a whim," he said. Shand looked at him. You want a whim, sir. 400 foot of wire on a drum and a horse on the arm, and I will have men out of that hole tonight. It is the only rope in this county that will go 216 foot, and it will not part, because I served it myself, and it wants no engine, and no boiler, and no shaft that can break. And Merritt Shand said, It is down. It is not down, said Jory Trewin. It is standing. Standing where? Sink Creek. There was a silence around that shaft collar that men who were there talked about for the rest of their lives. I sold it, Shand said. You did, sir. I sold it for $3. You did. Merritt Shand stood in the sun with his hat in his hand and did the arithmetic that he was going to be doing at 3 a.m. for the next 30 years. And then he turned around and started giving orders in a completely different voice, and the first one was for Rafe Odom. Rafe Odom took the 2 big camp wagons and 8 horses out of the tipple yard with 10 men in the beds and went the 6 miles to Sink Creek at a trot that no teamster would have allowed on that road on any other day of his life. He came into Alta Vance's yard at 25 minutes past 12. She was on the barn roof. That is where she was. She was patching the north slope of the barn roof with tar paper because she had no horses and no wagons and 13 days left, and a person has to do something with her hands, and Eb Nance was on the ground handing up nails. And they had both heard the far-off blowing of the mine whistle at 10:30 and had stood still and listened to it and had not known what it meant. Rafe Odom stood up on the wagon seat and told her in 20 words. Alta Vance came down off that roof on the ladder in about 4 seconds and hit the ground running for the whim. Take it, she said. Ma'am, it's yours, and there's no Rafe, take it. There's no time to talk about pay or about. I am coming with it, Alta Vance said, and so is my mare. And if any man at that camp wants to stand in front of me about it, he may try. Eb, get her in. Mr. Odom, that post is pinned with 4 oak keys, and they are marked, and the drum is 8 staves and 2 heads, and they are marked. And there is a man at the number 1 who marked them, and he had better be at that shaft when we get there, because I am not raising it without him. He's already there, Rafe Odom said. They had the whim down in 55 minutes. 10 men, who had spent the morning shoveling at a hole they could not empty, put their whole hearts into taking a thing apart. And the chalk numerals Jory Trewin had painted on those timbers in June were still legible. And every piece came off the one it was pinned to, and went into the wagon beds, in the order it would come out again. The wire rope went in the second wagon in its coil, with 4 men on the ends of the poles to walk it up the plank. And the last thing they loaded, at 10 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, was the arm, 20 feet of squared fir with an iron ring bolted through it near the end, and the wood at the ring worn shiny and dished on one side, worn by 5 years of a mare's teeth. Worn by the exact thing that a county had put a price of $1 on. Alta Vance led Maud out of the barn and up alongside the second wagon. Come on, she said. They want us. The 2 wagons came over the last rise above Verity at 20 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, with a woman in a faded blue dress walking at the head of a liver chestnut mare on the near side of the second one. And there were something over 200 people standing in that camp, because when a shaft goes in a coal town, nobody stays home. Wives, the store clerk. Cordelia Shand on the boarding house step with her hands at her mouth. Beddoes teamsters, who had been shoveling since noon and had blisters. The whole day shift that had been on top when it happened. 200 people and 1 road, and they came out into it and stood on both sides of it and did not say anything, and the wagons went up through the middle of them at a walk. Jory Trewin was standing at the shaft collar with a piece of chalk in his hand and his coat off, and he had already drawn on the packed ground exactly where every timber was going. And he had had 30 men digging the pit for the crib since 12 o'clock, 30 foot out from the collar and square to it, he said, when Alta got to him. The headframe's sound. She never touched the headframe. We hang the sheave in her over the manway, and we run our rope level from the drum to the sheave and down. Missus, you'll want to see this ground where she walks. There's a rock ledge under it, 3 inches down, on the east side. Take it out. We are. What happened between 3:20 and 12 minutes past 6 on the evening of the 24th of June, 1886, is the part of this story that men in Ammon County told for 40 years afterward, and every telling of it is a little different, and the parts that are the same in all of them are these. They dug a pit 4 feet deep in shale with 30 shovels and filled it with stone, and they stood the king post in it, 15 feet of squared fir, plumbed with a string and a rock, and they guyed the head of it with 4 legs of the condemned hoist rope to 4 dead men buried in the shale, and Rafe Odom made the strap-eyes for those guys on a fire he built on the ground beside the pit, because the shop was too far away to walk to. They built the drum around the post out of 8 staves and 2 heads with the chalk numerals still on them, and the last hoop went on with a maul at 5 o'clock. They set the arm, and it took 9 men to carry it and 1 to line it, and when it went home into its socket, Jory Trewin put his hand on it and said something in Cornish that nobody asked him to translate. They reeved 400 feet of stiff 7/8 wire over a sheave lashed into the headframe with chain, and reeving stiff wire rope with 40 men on it is a thing like arguing with a river, and it took 50 minutes. They brought out of the storehouse the iron sinking bucket that had raised the shale out of that shaft when it was sunk in 1884. A kibble 4 feet deep that a man could stand up in with his hands on the bale, and they hung it on the rope with a swivel and a shackle, and Rafe Odom put a new pin in that shackle and burred it over with a hammer, and then stood looking at it for longer than a pin takes to look at. And out at the end of the arm, from 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a liver chestnut mare stood in a whim collar with a woman at her head and waited. She waited 2 hours and 12 minutes. She did not paw. She did not call. Twice she reached out with her neck and set her top teeth on the arm at the ring and pulled a long draught of air down into herself and grunted. And both times a ripple went through the crowd, because everybody in Ammon County knew that noise and knew the joke that went with it, and there was nobody at all who felt like making it. At 20 minutes to 6, the crew came up out of the manway. They had cribbed and planked 22 feet of raw ground at the 90 with lagging boards set behind posts. And Gus Hovden's brother came off the ladder at the top of the good timber and said, "She'll pass." At 10 minutes to 6, they rapped 216 feet down the standing pipe, and the answer came back 11, and then something that took a while to work out, and then Jory Trewin, who had spent 30 years reading hammer talk, straightened up and said, 9 walking. 2 down, 1 with a leg. At 6 o'clock they put 600 pounds of shale in the kibble and lowered it to the bottom and brought it up again, and Maud walked her circle for the first time in a coal camp in 22 months, 8.5 turns of the drum, and the rope came up dry and the drum ran true, and nothing anywhere made a sound it should not have made. Then Merritt Shand took his coat off, which was the first time most of the men in that camp had ever seen it happen, and handed it to his sister and walked over to the kibble. There was an argument about it. Gus Hovden's brother wanted to go. 2 of the day shift wanted to go. Jory Trewin said flatly that the first man down ought to be a man who had been down a rope before. And Merritt Shand said that was exactly the point, and then he said the only speech he made that whole day, and he made it standing with one hand on the bail of an iron bucket, looking not at the men, but at a woman in a blue dress 30 feet away at the head of a horse. "I have got 11 men down there," he said, "and every one of them is down there, because I bought the best machine in this district and thought that finished the question. If this rig will carry me, it will carry anybody, and if it will not, then no one else has to find that out." He looked at Alta Vance. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "may I use your horse?" And Alta Vance said, "Her name is Maud. May I use your mare, Maud, you may." He got into the bucket. He was 44 years old, and he weighed 190 pounds, and he stood up in an iron kibble in his shirt sleeves, with both hands on the bale, and Jory Trewin took the brake handle himself, and let the drum run off against the wood. Slow, a foot a second, and Merritt Shand went down into the ground he had sunk, on 400 feet of rope he had sold for scrap. Hanging under a drum turned by a horse he had priced at $1 on a fence post 77 days before. The bucket touched bottom at 12 minutes past 6. 200 people stood in a coal camp in the long yellow evening light and did not make a sound, and at the end of a 20-foot arm a mare that a whole county had laughed at leaned into a collar that fit her, and set her feet and waited to be told. Jory Trewin stood at the drum with his hand on the brake and looked out along the arm and said, in a voice that carried across 200 people without being raised at all, "Come up, Queen." And the mare reached out her neck and set her top teeth on the arm at the ring, in the dished place her own mouth had worn in that fur over 5 years, and pulled a long, slow draught of air down into herself with a sound like a door opening in another room, and stepped off to the left. The drum turned. The rope came off the sheave in the headframe and went up onto the drum, a coil at a time, wet at first from the shaft and then not, and the mare walked at that flat, unvarying freighter's walk that never hurried and never varied, and Alta Vance walked at her head with one hand on the cheekpiece of the halter and did not look at anything but the mare's ear. 8.5 turns of the drum. 9 minutes and a little. At 29 minutes past 6 in the evening on the 24th of June, 1886, the bale of an iron bucket came up out of the collar of the Verity No. 2 into the yellow light with a man standing in it, and the man was Christy Penrose, who was 23 years old and had been under 216 feet of Wyoming since 22 minutes past 10 that morning. And he came up black to the eyes with his lamp still in his hat, and when they took him out of the kibble his legs would not hold him, and he sat down in the shale, and his wife got to him before anybody could stop her. The sound that camp made is not a thing that can be written down. Then Jory Trewin said, "Down, and let the drum run off against the brake." And the mare stood in her tracks with her sides going, and 216 feet below her another man got into a bucket. They brought them up one at a time, because a whim brings them up one at a time. Owen Reese at 47 minutes past 6, Nils Berg at 3 minutes past 7, Antone Perotti at 20 minutes past 7, who was Italian and had 30 words of English and used 4 of them, over and over, with his hand on the mare as they walked him past her. Josiah Pyle at 38 minutes past 7. A man they called Big Hollis at 55 minutes past. And after each one the crowd made that sound, and after each one Jory Trewin said down, and the arm stopped, and the mare stood, and Eb Nance came in under her neck with a bucket and a sponge, and wet her mouth, and sluiced her chest and her shoulders, and went away again. At the 6th lift somebody said out loud what everybody had been thinking for an hour, which was that they were asking one 14-year-old mare to do the work of a steam engine for the whole of a night, and Merritt Shand's foreman on top sent for the biggest gelding in the camp string, a black 4-year-old that stood 16'2" and could pull a house down. They hitched him in at 25 minutes past 8 with 2 men at his head. It took 3 minutes. He would not walk a circle. He did not know how. He came into the collar and hit it and got the load moving, and then, when the drag came steady on him and did not let up, he broke and rushed and shortened the circle and swung his hind end out and got a hind leg over the arm's shadow and lost his mind about it entirely, and it took 4 men to get him clear, and Jory Trewin said, "Out. Out. Take him out," in a voice like a slammed door, and afterwards said to nobody in particular, "Any horse. They do say it. Any horse." Then he said, "Come up, Queen." And the mare put her teeth on the arm and pulled her draught of air and stepped off left, and the drum turned. The sun went off the shale dumps at about 8:15, and it was full dark by 9, and by then there were 22 lanterns hung on the headframe, and on the arm, and on poles driven around the ring, and the mare's shadow went around and around across the faces of a crowd that did not go home, and the dust she raised stood in the lantern light in a low ring at her knees, and she walked in it. Alta Vance walked 14 lifts at that mare's head, and afterward could not tell anybody one single thing she had thought about during any of them. She remembered the ear. She remembered that the halter cheekpiece was warm in her fingers, and that she kept having to change hands. She remembered that at some point in the 8th lift, she noticed she had been counting the paces out loud under her breath. In Cornish, because Jory Trewin had been counting them out loud in Cornish for 4 hours, and she had picked it up off him without knowing it, and that when she realized it she nearly laughed, and then very nearly did something else instead. And she remembered the lanterns. Because the men holding those lanterns around that ring, standing there hour after hour so that a horse would have light to put her feet in, were the same men who had leaned on her corral rail and laughed at a noise. 2 of Ortbeto's teamsters, who had ridden 9 miles out of their way on a Sunday in June to sit their horses at her gate and enjoy themselves, stood on the north side of that ring from dark until 21 minutes past 10, and held a lantern apiece at the level of a horse's knee, and did not put them down, and did not speak to her, and did not go home. There is a kind of apology that has no words in it at all, and takes 6 hours, and that is the kind those 2 men made. 216 feet down, Merritt Shand and Dr. Amos Sewell got a sling under a man named Farley Dunn, who had a broken thigh and had been lying in 6 inches of water on a door for 9 hours, and they brought him up at 40 minutes past 9. And the mare walked that one at the same pace as all the others, because there is only one pace on a whim, and 200 people watched an iron bucket come up out of the ground at the speed of a man climbing stairs, and not one of them breathed. The second hurt man came up at 4 minutes past 10. He had taken bad air, and had been carried the last of the way by the others, and he was not properly awake, and they lifted him out of the kibble like something that would break. Dr. Sewell came up at 12 minutes past 10, and at 21 minutes past 10 at night, the last turn of that drum brought Merritt Shand up out of his own shaft. He came up into 22 lanterns and 200 people, and he did not look at any of them. He got out of the bucket and stood on his own ground, and he turned around and he looked for the horse, and the arm was coming round toward him with the mare on the end of it, wet to the flanks, white with lather where the collar sat, dust to the knees, walking, and Jory Trewin said, "Whoa, Queen," and the drum stopped. Merritt Shand walked over to her. He put his hand flat on her neck and stood there. He was a man who had had a very great deal to say for 15 years about steam, and about the century, and about what a modern plant would do, and he stood in the lantern light, with his hand on a $1 mare, and could not get one word of it out. The count, which the Ammon County Register printed on the 1st of July, and which the Territorial Mine Inspector copied into his annual report that fall, was this: 11 men went into the Verity No. 2 on the morning of the 24th of June, and 11 men came out of it. 14 lifts were made on a horse whim in 5 hours and 20 minutes, all of them on the same rope. The rope did not part. The drum did not check. One mare walked, by Jory Trewin's count of the turns, a shade under 3 miles that night, all of it in a circle 42 paces around, and at the end of it she was blowing and she was sound, and after they had walked her out for half an hour and rubbed her down, she put her head into a bucket of gruel Cordelia Shand had made with her own hands, and ate the whole of it. Alta Vance sat down on a pile of lagging boards at 11:30, with her blue dress ruined to the knees, and her hands shaking from 6 hours of holding a cheekpiece, and Rafe Odom sat down beside her without asking, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Alta said, "Somebody has to walk her home." "Ma'am," Ray Fodum said, "there is not a man in this camp who would let you walk that mare anywhere tonight, and he was right, and they did not." Merritt Shand rode out to Sink Creek on the morning of the 26th of June with a company ledger under his arm and a clerk behind him, and he did not stay on his horse in her yard the way Ort Beto had. He got down. He took his hat off at the door, and when Alta Vance told him to come in, he came in and sat at her kitchen table and put the ledger on it and opened it, and then he sat for a moment with both hands flat on the page. "I have been up 2 nights doing this," he said, "and I want you to hear the whole of it before you say anything, because you are going to want to say no in the middle, and I would rather you said no at the end." Then he read it out, itemized, the way a man reads a bill. Hire of 1 hoisting plant, being the whim gear, drum, arm, king post, and 400 feet of wire rope. The property of Alta Vance, for 1 night and its removal from her ground and the labor of taking it down, $65. Purchase of the said plant outright by the company, at valuation, it being now permanently erected on company ground at the number 2, $185. Hire of 1 mare, 14 lifts, for the raising of 11 men, and here Merritt Shand stopped, and looked at the page and said, "I put $140 against that line, and I want to tell you why. Because it is not a number I picked out of the air. That is what this company paid for that mare at Laramie in May of 1879, and it is written in Trewin's book, and it is the last honest figure anybody in this outfit ever put on her. I would rather buy her back at the price we paid than pretend I know what she is worth, because I do not, and neither does anybody else, and that is the entire lesson of the past 60 hours. "You are not buying her," Alta said. "No, that is higher. She is yours. I have learned that much. Total, $390. And then the second part, which was the part that mattered, and which he laid out with the flat competence of a man who was very good at his trade when his trade was not being used against somebody. The territorial mine inspector had been at the number 2 since Friday noon. He was going to require, in his report and in his rules, that every working shaft in that district keep a standby hoist independent of its steam plant, with a horse or a pair kept within call of the collar. That was not a favor. That was going to be law by September, and Merritt Shand had spent Thursday night at the bottom of a hole learning why. The Verity Coal and Coke Company therefore proposed to contract with Alta Vance for a term of 2 years. For the keep and standing of 2 horses at the number 2 collar and a man on them at $60 the month, renewable, and the company proposed to advance against that contract, on the signing, the sum of $500, which was, to the dollar, what she owed. Alta Vance sat in her own kitchen with her hands in her lap and did not say anything for a while. "I want to be clear," she said at last. "This is not charity. Mrs. Vance, if I gave you a nickel out of charity, my directors would have my position by the 15th of August, and they would be right. This is the cheapest insurance this company will ever buy, and I only know that because it cost me 11 men and 1 night to find out. There is nothing in it for you but work. Then I will take it." "Good. One thing first," Alta said. She got up and went to the door and took the blue dress off the hook and put her hand in the pocket and came back and set an 1881 silver dollar on the kitchen table between them, worn smooth on the high points, eagle up, the way he had laid it on the corral post on the 8th of April. Merritt Shand looked at it and did not touch it. "That's yours," Alta said. "I have carried it 78 days. Take it back, Mr. Shand, because I am not going to spend the rest of my life owning a thing a man handed me to tell me what I was worth. I would rather you kept it." "I know you would," said Alta Vance. He picked it up, he turned it over once, and put it in the pocket of his waistcoat, and he carried it there for the next 25 years, and it was in that pocket when he died in Denver in 1911. And his daughter, who never got the whole story out of him, thought it was a keepsake from a woman he had loved. In a way it was. The sale was not canceled, because in the territory of Wyoming in 1886, a sheriff's sale duly noticed and advertised was not a thing a superintendent could cancel with a wave of his hand, and so on the morning of the 7th of July at 10 o'clock, the sheriff of Ammon County stood on the courthouse steps at Pilcher and called it, exactly as advertised, in front of the largest crowd that had ever gathered at that building for any purpose. They came from Corliss Springs. They came from the camp, all of them, the whole day shift, Christy Penrose with his wife on his arm, and Farley Dunn on 2 crutches with his thigh in splints, carried up the steps by 4 men so he could be in the front. Jory Trewin was there in a coat. Rafe Odom was there with $130 in his pocket that he never got to spend. Cordelia Shand was there, and had baked, and did not have a word to say to anybody, and afterward went and put her hand on Alta Vance's arm, in front of 9 people who had heard every one of her stories. And Ort Beto was there with a roll of money, and 2 men to drive. The sheriff read the notice. Then, because the statute required it, he read the appraisal. He read it the way a clerk reads a document, in a flat voice, item by item, out over that crowd in the hot morning. 4 heavy mares at $28, 3 saddle horses at $15, $15 and $12, 1 brown gelding, aged at $18, the wagons, the harness. And then he came to the last line on the sheet, and he read it out just as it was written, because that is what a man in his office does. 1 mare, chestnut, windsucker, $1. Nobody laughed. It is worth stopping on that, because it is the whole of it. 1 days earlier, that same line, spoken out loud in the same county by the same class of men, had got a laugh out of 5 people at a fence. Now it was read from a legal document on the courthouse steps to a crowd of 300. 10 days after the mare in question had walked a shade under 3 miles in a circle in the dark and brought 11 men out of the ground one at a time, and 300 people stood in the sun in absolute silence and let it land, and the man who had said it was standing in the 3rd row with his hat off. Then the sheriff turned the page and read the release, and the levy was discharged. The judgment satisfied in full on the 6th of July, 1886, by draft of the Verity Coal and Co. Company, and the property of Alta Vance was restored to her, and the sale was declared off. Ort Beto put his money back in his coat and walked to his barn, and did not come out for the rest of the day. They brought her horses home that afternoon down the Pilcher Road. 13 head and 3 wagons, and a set of chain harness with the tug spliced twice, driven by 6 men from the camp who had asked for the job, and Eb Nance stood at the gate and held it open and did not manage it well at all. The whim went back up over the manway at the number 2 and stayed there. Rafe Odom ironed it properly the second time, with forged straps and a bronze step under the king post. And the company painted it, and Alta Vance kept 2 horses standing at that collar under contract from the 1st of August, 1886, until the shaft was worked out in 1901. The spur came in September, as Merritt Shand had said it would, and it finished the freight business in Ammon County exactly as he had said it would. And by the following spring, Alta Vance was the only teaming outfit left between Pilcher and the Sweetwater, with a contract in her hand, and it was the one nobody had wanted to sell her. Ort Beto sold his barn in 1888 and went to Nebraska. The territorial inspector's rule came out that autumn, and it stood until the state took over, and after 1887 there was not a working shaft in that end of the country without a standby rig at the collar, and a horse or a pair kept within call of it. The men called them Vance rigs, which was not something anybody voted on. It was just what they got called. Jory Truen ran the whim at the number 2 until 1893, and never in 7 years let another man take the brake handle on a lift with a person on the rope. He died in the winter of 1894 at 76, and they carried him up the hill at Pilcher on their shoulders, and there were 11 men in that procession who did not have to be told why they were there. Eb Nance stayed until 1892, and then took up his own place on the Sweetwater, with 4 mares Alta gave him, and named the first foal he ever raised out of them Queen, and never once explained it to his wife. Rafe Odom married Alta Vance in October of 1888 in the front room at Sink Creek, with 20 people there. He had been coming out on Saturdays for 2 years by then, and had never said one word to her that could not have been said in front of a preacher, and when he finally said the one that could not, he said it standing at the corral in the dark, looking at the horses, in about 9 words, and she said yes in 3. And Maud. Alta Vance did the thing for that mare that nobody in the history of Ammon County had ever thought to do for a crib biter, which was that she stopped trying to take it away from her and gave her a place to do it. Rafe peeled a straight aspen pole and set it on 2 posts beside the barn door at exactly the height of the point of the mare's shoulder, round, smooth, at the end of her reach, and it was the only thing on that place ever built for a horse to chew. Maud used it every day of her life. Visitors asked about it for 13 years, and Alta gave them all the same answer, which was that it was a rail, and left them to work out the rest of it on their own. Maud stood the standby at the number 2 through 1897, which is to say she stood at a shaft collar for 11 years, and was called for on 31 occasions, and never once failed to take the load. Then she came home to Sink Creek, and did nothing at all for 2 years, which she seemed to find agreeable, and she died in the pasture on a bright cold morning in November of 1899 at 27 years of age, which is a very long life for a horse that a man once told a crowd was worth $2 for the meat of her. They buried her at the east corner, inside the ring she had worn in the sod herself, and Alta Vance would not let anybody plow it or fence across it, and that ring was still visible from the rise above Sink Creek in 1940, when a woman of 85, who had been born in that house, pointed it out to a man from the county road department and made him move his survey line 40 feet. Alta Vance died in 1931 at 76. In the top drawer of the bureau in the front room, when they cleared the house, there was a folded appraisal sheet dated the 8th of April 1886, in a grocer's careful hand, with the last line on it reading 1 mare. Chestnut, windsucker, $1. She had kept it for 45 years. She had never framed it, and she had never shown it to anybody, and nobody who knew her ever needed to ask why she kept it, because they had all worked out by then what that piece of paper actually was. It was not a record of what a horse was worth. It was a record of what a group of men could see on a Thursday morning in April, with the light good and the animals standing right in front of them at the end of a rope, which was nothing. Nothing at all. They looked at 2 white saucers on a mare's shoulders where a collar had sat for 5 years, and they saw damage. They looked at 4 feet worn crooked from 10,000 circles, and they saw a defect. They looked at a mouth beveled by an oak arm, and they saw a vice, and they heard the sound she made when she got ready to work, and they thought it was funny. Every mark on that mare was a certificate. Every single one of them was the proof of exactly what she was, written on her body in the only handwriting she had, and it took a woman nobody would listen to, and an old man nobody had thought to ask to read 1 line of it out loud. That is the part worth carrying out of this. The marks a life leaves on a body are not a list of what is wrong with it. They are a record of what it has done, and they are lying there in plain sight on every worn-out, passed over, laughed at thing in this world, waiting on somebody with the patience to read them the right way up. And there is not one of us who has not stood in an alley somewhere at the end of a rope, while a man who had never asked us a single question told a crowd what we were worth.